Hi. We're going to talk now about an area of English phonology that I think really needs more research, and I'm hoping that we can do some of that research in this course. So the area is word final t, as in the word bet. We talked already in some detail about the allophonic pattern for word internal phoneme t. So it can surface as aspirated. If you recall the environment for aspiration, it's when the t comes at the beginning of a stressed syllable in teen or attain, where the second syllable is stressed. It can be unaspirated when it does not start the syllable, as in stay, and we studied that in our discussion sections. It can be flapped, so in words like butter and beta, you get a flap t. And it can also be a glottal stop in one particular environment, word internally in mainstream American English, in button. So when you have a bisyllabic word, stress on the first syllable, and where the second syllable is a syllabic nasal. The pattern's pretty stable in mainstream American English. And there are a few places, like in the word mountain or mountain, you might get some variation, but for the most part, these are pretty fixed pronunciations. But word final t is a lot more complicated and variable. It can be realized as t, so if you said bet, flap, I bet $1 million. I bet because. There's an example of a glottalized or glottal stop. As well as phonologically conditioned, the variation in how final t is pronounced is likely to be regionally conditioned, and I'll talk a little bit about this as we go through, but a lot more research is needed, both on the phonological conditioning and on the regional conditioning. So what do we know about phonological conditioning? Well, Julie Roberts did a study of Vermont speakers that's really interesting. The main point of it is that Vermont speakers see glottalization, or dropping the t's, as a marked regional aspect of their phonology. And she thought it would be interesting to see if there was any movement towards getting rid of it, since in a lot of areas we're getting more homogeneous pronunciations. And she found, in fact, that that the younger people are producing plenty of glottalization. So she studied both social and phonological factors. I'm going to talk a little bit about the phonological factors. This table shows the effect of the following segment. So the data for this table includes both word final and word medial t, but over 90%, the vast majority of these cases were final stops, like in the word bet. It also includes cases where both a consonant and a vowel proceed, but again, 70% were preceded by a vowel. So most of these cases are cases like we were just talking about in the word bet. So before a pause, that's the place where you're most likely to get glottalization. That was a big bet. And glottalization does feel natural for me there too. Then we have different following word initial sounds if it's the bet plus another word, and there's these numbers are pretty close, but there's less glottalization before a nasal than before pause or a glide, even less before an obstruent like ba, and even less before a vowel or a liquid. A more recent study looked at speakers from Columbus and around there. And again, we're looking at what follows the underlying t, the phoneme t, and we're splitting up the environments by manner of the following consonants. So again, approximant nasals being one branch, and then other kinds of stops and fricatives, obstruents, being on the other branch. A big difference between this study and the one of Vermont has to do with where pause, that is the end of the phrase, is. So for phrase final position, that's not a very common place to get glottalization in Ohio, whereas in Vermont, that was the most probable place to get glottalization. That was the place where you'd most likely get glottalization. In our final project in this course 7 years ago, we ran an experiment on final ta. Our main interest was the effect of having different kinds of vowel following. So these other studies we just talked about were most interested in the consonant that follows, or consonant versus pause. We were interested in whether there was a difference between stressed and stressless vowels. Within stressless syllables, so stressed and stressless, that would be stressed, hit Andrew versus hit Amanda. Hit Amanda, you have a stressless syllable in the first syllable of Amanda. Hit a ball. Here we have a stressless syllable, but it's a function word as opposed to the first syllable in Amanda, which is the first syllable of a lexical word. We also had another condition where we had function words that had nasals in them, like hit and broke. And then finally, a word that started with, we varied the consonant in the initial syllable of this. So these are just examples. We had probably 5 sentences for each one that we had read. We took the methodology from a prior study on glottalization by Eddington and Taylor, where you repeat a sentence with the ta masked by noise. This worked quite well, and we got interesting results, I think. First of all, there's a big difference between stressed and most of the other stressless categories. There's also a difference between stressless when it starts a lexical word versus a function word. And then finally, this condition is maybe the most interesting because we're getting lots of glottalization. So this is the probability of a flap. So very low probability of a flap in a case like hit Andrew, which I can do, but it sounds unnatural for me as well. Hit and broke is most often with a glottal stop, and that's probably because of the nasal, which is like the word internal case that we talked about in the beginning, where when you have a following nasal, you get glottal stop word internally. So it seems like the pattern is active in some way in between words as well as within words. I do think there's regional conditioning here. We saw some evidence of that in the comparison between Vermont and Ohio. It sounds to me like there's more final glottalization in Western Massachusetts than where I grew up in Kingston, Ontario. For my daughter, for example, it's more natural for her to say, get with a glottal stop in, did you get everything? Like that. Whereas for me, it's more natural to say, did you get everything? As I say, this is really understudied compared to a lot of other things like the vowels of different varieties. And it seems like something that we might want to try to get a little bit more information on in our final project about what's happening with this in Western Massachusetts.